maddening pace. We're supposed to cover 2 more chapters in the book of 1 Corinthians tonight, which has been the case the last 3 weeks. This week we're going to be looking at chapters 7 through 8. So if you haven't turned over there in your Bibles, you might want to go ahead and turn over there. And I'll just mention before we actually do the first question here, there's kind of a shift in the writing of this letter of Paul. All the things that we've looked at previously, Paul's dealt with some problems that were pretty common knowledge to everybody that he addressed that were present in the church at Corinth. And starting right here in chapter 7 in this letter that he wrote, there's a shift because he begins answering some specific questions that had been written to him by the Corinthians. And of course, as we go through the book, we'll find, we'll look at tonight, some of them dealt with marriage, some of them dealt with meat that was offered to idols. You had the question about spiritual gifts, chapters 12 through 14. Chapter 15, you had questions about the resurrection. And then in chapter 16, you had some questions about the gathering or the offering that was being taken up for the poor saints at Jerusalem. And so just kind of be aware of that. I'll probably bring it up from time to time, but there's a little bit of shift in the way that he's writing here. So as I mentioned, chapter 7 deals with marriage, and the question number 1 here is kind of a thought-provoking question, deals in part with what Paul's going to cover here tonight, but after I read the question and thought about it, I kind of want to rephrase it a little bit, because the original question is, what is good and bad about remaining single and getting married? So I think I want to redo it and just say, what is good about either being single or being married? So let's start with being married. What's good about being married? Oh boy. Husbands, I don't want you to get in too much trouble. Now, Lanny's brave when his wife isn't sitting by him. You can see that. So,
companionship.
Okay, that would be one of the benefits of marriage, wouldn't it? Companionship. What else? Accountability. Okay. All of us need to be held accountable, don't we? And probably no one holds us more accountable than our spouse. What else? Can you think of anything else? Children. Yeah, family. Children. Never gonna, that's one of the blessings of marriage, and even better, as what everybody tells me, it's the grandchildren that come after. So Glenn's shaking his head in approval. So yeah, that would be one of the benefits and good things about getting married. What else? Anything else come to mind? Helper, yeah, support. There's a lot of ups and downs in lives, and sometimes when you experience those downs, if you're by yourself, it's a little harder. It's always nice to have family around you and people who care for you. And of course, nobody's going to do that more and be closer to you than your spouse. What else? Anything else you can think of? There's probably there are a number of good things that we could talk about, but suffice it to say just that's just a few of the things that benefit us from being married. So what about a person who chooses to remain single? Is there any benefit in that, or benefits from that?
Peace of mind.
I don't even know what that means. You want to elaborate on that, or we want to observe the Passover on that one?
I'd ask my wife first.
Oh, okay.
Really, it's the best thing in the world to be, to have that kind of relationship. But it's also, it's been so long since I've been single, I've really kind of forgotten most things I ever knew about being single. But it's great.
Okay. So he's covering his tracks now. Anybody?
Because I know somebody's going to rat me out.
Anybody want to expound on the being single or remaining single?
We're recording these, right?
Yeah, they're being broadcast live. That's true, and they're archived. They're recorded and archived. So you can be held accountable for what you say, and will be probably. Go ahead, Judy.
I think as far as being single, I don't know that it's a benefit, but if you don't have someone you love, then you don't have worry and anxiety for if something happens to them. You can't suffer a loss if you never had it.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are, when you think about family and being married, there's other responsibilities and cares and anxieties and, distresses that come along with that too. And Paul writes about that idea, in fact, here in this chapter, about a person who chooses to remain single, he doesn't have to worry about those things, does he? In fact, he even talks about the idea that he can really solely devote himself or herself to God. What do you have, Judy?
I was going to say, I can't find a whole lot of things about being single that's good.
Okay.
You just got to be there to.
So, there's the question becomes this then, is a person who chooses to remain single or either chooses to become married, is one state, sub-spiritual to the other?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, is one state super spiritual to the other?
Well, I think scriptures kind of talk about that a little bit, just in that they're able to devote more time to God because they don't have to devote time to their mate and assume that they don't devote time to children if they choose to be single all their life.
Yeah, but as far as, the way that God views it, are you going to be in better or worse standing if you choose one state or the other in God's eyes? No. I mean, what the Bible teaches us is everybody has to decide that for themselves, right? And so we have to make the decision whether we're going to get married or whether we're going to remain single. And again, I want to emphasize here, when we read here in chapter 7, this chapter 7 isn't a complete theology on marriage. Okay? In other words, it's not everything that the Bible has to say on it and everything that Jesus taught on it, things like that. Paul's answering specific questions that these people had and that they wrote to him about. Unfortunately, we don't have, word for word what those questions were. And so we kind of have to read Paul's writings and kind of put two and two together and try to deduce what those questions were that were being asked. But keep in mind, Paul's not trying to cover every biblical thought and idea and doctrine on marriage. He's just answering very specific questions that were directed to him by the church at Corinth. And so you're not going to find everything that the Bible says here on this subject. But there are certain situations that Paul does specifically address. So let's start here in chapter 7 and really in verse number 2. Paul talks about the idea of marriage and, of course, the idea of avoiding fornication. And why should each man have his own wife and each woman have her own husband?
Avoid those things, fornication.
Yeah, to avoid fornication, or we would it's probably better described in our language as unlawful sex. Sex is one of those things that God has given to man. It's the way that He's made us. It's one of those subjects in the Bible that nobody likes to talk about. It's kind of like money, But the Bible has plenty to say on the subject, doesn't it? And so God made us this way for a reason. It's good He made us this way, because it'd be kind of hard to carry on humanity without it, wouldn't it? So God gave us that. It's also a blessing within the marriage relationship, because it allows two people to form a relationship that's closer than any other relationship you have with anybody else. And so God established that, and God instituted it, and gave it to us, and then gave us a lawful way to fulfill it. And those desires, according to God's law, are only going to be lawfully fulfilled within the realm of marriage. So if you can't avoid fornication, you can't avoid unlawful sex, then Paul says you need to get married. You know, every man needs to have his own wife. Every woman needs to have her own husband. Question number 3 is, to whom does a Christian's body belong if he or she is married? According to verse 4 here.
His mate.
Yeah, it's not that your mate has sole ownership over your body, but it's a mutual ownership, isn't it? You know, your body is not solely belonging to yourself. And again, remember that Paul's answering some very specific questions that the church at Corinth has here. And what we find as we read this chapter is there were some outward physical persecutions or struggles of some kind that Christians in the area of Corinth were experiencing. And so they had some questions about what should we do in this present time. You know, because of this difficult situation that we're encountering, what are some things that we should do? And one of the questions that was asked evidently was, should we just completely abstain from any intimate relationship with one another? And of course, what Paul talks about here is he talks about the idea, you know, refraining or abstaining from that intimate act. It needs to be a mutual consent. If that's what you decide to do, that's fine. But it needs to have the consent of both parties. Because whenever you get married, your body is no longer just your own. It doesn't just belong to you. It also belongs to your spouse. And so neither one has full authority over the other. And so I guess what Paul kind of illustrated would be, you know, Paul's saying if the man says in this situation, well, because of this present distress, I think it's best that we don't. And the wife doesn't agree to it, don't just go off and do it because you want to. Not right. And so both of you have a say in this part, and both of you have a say in the authority over our bodies. So, again, it's pertaining to the idea, the question, the current situation that was being experienced here, and I think that's going to become more evident as we go on. So question number 4 is this. Paul addresses in verse 5, why should neither the husband or the wife deprive each other of our sexual needs?
Well, that'll cause the devil to tempt them, in other ways, or other people.
Yeah, because of temptation, right? And so you already have this principle, you know, if you can't avoid unlawful sex, Paul says better to get married. Better if each man has his own wife and each wife has his own husband. You do that in order to avoid, not just totally the only reason, but in part, to avoid violating God's law. But if within that marriage relationship, without the consent of the other partner, one deprives the other one, then temptation once again arises, doesn't it? The temptation to fulfill that desire in an unlawful way. And we know Satan. You know, Satan is going to use anything and everything against us that he can, isn't he? Do you think he would use sexual desires or temptations against us? Of course he would, right? There's no modesty. There's no areas where Satan isn't going to go or use to try to get us to violate God's law. And that includes the act of sex. And of course, you study the Corinthian society, and I think their society was a lot like ours today, probably even more so, because, I mean, to me, it's just crazy how much sex is presented to our society today. I mean, it's through about every avenue that you can think of. But the Corinthian area was the same way. And so when you live in an area like that, or in a society like that, is the temptation going to be greater? Yeah, it's going to be constantly being presented to you. It's going to be constantly trying to be impressed upon your mind. And so Paul says, you know, don't go there where you're reaching a point where you're going to be tempted to try to fulfill those desires in an unlawful way. Satan can use that, and he will use that against us. There is the special situation, though, that he mentions here. And this is the only reason that I know of in the Scripture. If somebody else knows of, they can chime in here. But the only reason that I know of in the scripture why it said that a husband and wife might refrain from having an intimate relationship. And what specifically does Paul give? What reasons does he give here for that?
Prayer and fasting.
Yeah, prayer and fasting. And so in order to have a more spiritual focus, I think is what he's talking about. You know, a lot of times in the scripture you'll read about people abstaining from physical things like food to try to focus more on the spiritual. And so I think that's kind of the same idea here, to take the focus off of the physical and kind of be more spiritually minded. But it is a special situation here that Paul is talking about. We don't have time to look at everything in this chapter, but I did want to bring up verse 15 here, because this is one that's used within the religious world, and sometimes, unfortunately, even within the Lord's church. But Paul wrote there, he said, if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. And so the question that I have here in verse 6 is, do the words not under bondage in such allow for another exception for divorce and remarriage, that is, besides fornication that Jesus gave? What's Paul talking about in this verse?
Well, he's talking about a spouse that is not a believer.
Okay.
And he's saying that they're not to depart for that reason, because you won't have any influence then on that person that isn't a believer, and that your job is to help everyone become a child of God,
Yeah.
especially so when you're married to them.
Yeah, and so, again, remember, Paul's answering some specific questions here. It's not just randomly writing about stuff, but evidently were some pretty specific situations and circumstances that the church at Corinth had in mind. And evidently, one of the questions was, what should married Christians do at this time? Is it better for them to separate from one another because of this present distress that's being experienced? And of course, Paul writes in verse 10, no. God said in marriage, wife's not to depart from her husband, and the husband's not to depart from his wife. So don't divorce, don't separate because of that. Well, what about an unbeliever and a believer? What about a Christian who's married to a non-Christian in this particular time? And what Paul starts writing about there in verse 12 is, well, as long as that unbeliever is content, as long as they're willing to stay within that marriage, no, the Christian spouse shouldn't leave them. They need to stay with them. But then the question becomes, well, what if that unbeliever is not content? And what if that unbeliever takes it upon themselves to separate or to divorce that Christian mate at that time? And I think all that Paul is saying here is he just told them before, don't leave. Don't divorce, don't separate, don't allow that breach to happen. But I think what he's saying in this situation is, what can you do if your spouse decides to divorce you? What can you do if they decide they want a separation? Can you hold the marriage together if they don't want to? I mean, it's impossible. It's impossible to not allow the separation to take place or the divorce to take place. And so Paul's talking about, I don't think he's talking about, you're free to go out and remarry, but you're not in bondage to keep that marriage together. And there's a couple of things, this is one of those things that you can spend a whole study on, but I'll just mention one thing real briefly, and it really has to do with the original language. And depending on how deeply you want to study it and research it and look into it, it's up to you. But you can take about any Greek interlinear Bible. And, we've talked about that before. It'll show you what the Greek word is. It'll give you the English meaning. It'll tell you what tense it's in and how many people and, cases and all the things like that. But what you'll find if you look in one of these, and I don't know one that doesn't acknowledge that this verb is not in bondage is in what's called the perfect tense. And if you don't know anything about the perfect tense in the Greek language, just do a little bit of research on your own. I mean, you could probably Google it. I don't know how. It'd probably be pretty accurate. Don't take my word for it, but it would probably give you an idea of the main emphasis of the perfect tense. And what you'll find is, if you do a little bit of research, the emphasis of the perfect tense in the Greek language is continuous action that has happened in the past. Now, this is important because if you'll look at those interlinear Bibles, they'll translate it like this: a brother or sister is not having been bound. You see the present tense, present perfect situation, not having been bound. It's not just that they were bound at one time and now they're loose from it. He says, you've never been bound. You've never been in this type of bondage. And so the type of bondage that Paul's talking about, again, continuous action in the past, you've never been in this type of bondage at any point. It can't be marriage, can it? Because at some point in time, they were in bondage in marriage, right? They were bound in some way. So whatever bondage she's talking about here is not one that's not having been in the past. They've never been in the past in this way. And so it's important because what that shows me is he's not talking about marriage bond. He's not talking about the idea you're now free to go out and marry somebody else. And so again, depending on how deeply you want to study it and think about it, you can do that. But I think the context is pretty straightforward too, where you put it in context what Paul is talking about and then what he expounds upon. And so, no, it's not another exception for divorce and remarriage. Paul's not talking about the idea of the marriage bond there, but they're not bound in such a way. And think about this as a Christian. We're never bound in that way, never have been in a marriage relationship. If your spouse takes it on them to divorce and to separate, what can you do? You're not in bondage. Never have been. Never been that way in the past. You're not that way now. You'll never be that way in bondage in the future in that way. In other words, it's not your duty to hold that marriage together. You can't. There's nothing you can do if the spouse wants to separate or leave or divorce you. And so I think, again, you kind of read the context. That's what Paul's emphasizing there. Anybody got any comments or questions or anything about that particular verse? I hate to go fast, but we got to move here. So, question number 7, what is more important, though, than whether a person is married or single? Yeah, keeping God's commandments. Now, I want you to notice verse 26 here in this chapter. Paul says this. Notice what he's writing. He says, I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress. Remember, I told you there's some kind of outwardly physical thing, persecution or something that's happening to these Corinthians because of marriage. And he says that it's good for a man to remain as he is. If you go to verse 35, he says, and this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. Now he's talking about marriage there, or getting married. In other words, if you get married during this present distress, there's going to be some distractions because of that. And so it's all indicating to us there was something outwardly, physically, that was going on that was distressing the marriage relationship, especially for those Christians at Corinth. So that's kind of the context. Paul's talking about it's not really important. The important thing is not whether you're married or not whether you're single, but whether you're keeping God's commandments. And what he talks about in this chapter, because of this present distress, it's going to be easier to keep God's commandments if you're single. If you're going to get married, it's going to cause you some trouble. You're going to have trouble in the flesh, he says. But, if you can't contain yourself, go ahead and marry. It's better than that than violate God's law. So he emphasizes the keeping of God's commandments is what's important. Verse 8, we already covered that, why Paul think it best to remain single at the present time because of the stress, the heavy strain, the trouble in the flesh that people would experience because of it. Question number 9. So, how should the fact, he talks about time being short, how should the fact that time is short affect our priorities and our actions, and even when it comes to marriage itself? What does that mean, the time is short?
Is he alluding to the idea that we don't know when Christ is going to return?
Well, yeah. I mean, that could certainly be part of it, couldn't it? Could be a lot shorter than what we think, couldn't it?
Or you never know when you're going to, tomorrow's not promised, you never know if you're going to roll out of bed the next day.
That's right. Yeah. We're not promised tomorrow, right? We're not guaranteed that everything's going to be like it is today. And really, I mean, when you think about this world and this life, what is it compared to eternity? It's really short. That's hard to comprehend now, isn't it? Because to us, it's everything right now, isn't it? But when you compare this world and this life to what's going to happen and the time that we're going to spend in eternity, just a short time. And so Paul says, remember that. Remember this world isn't everything. And physical relationships here on this world don't mean everything too. There's things that are going to change in the future. And so keep your eye on eternity. Live for eternity, not for this world. Question number 10 is, do unmarried people have an advantage in serving God? What did Paul say? Yeah. In marriage, when you have a family and when you're married, you have, I don't want it to sound bad, but you have more people to please. You got to try to keep everybody happy. If you're a single guy, who do you have to please? God. So it's a lot simpler, isn't it? And Paul kind of emphasized that you're going to have more people to please, you're going to have more to care for. And so if you're single, you're going to have an advantage in this present distress because you're going to be able to focus solely on serving God without any of these distractions that are being caused by people being married at this time. Now again, I want to emphasize, Paul's writing in chapter 7, this isn't like a general cover-all every situation. There was a present distress that was happening. And so Paul's talking about at this time, it's better if a person can remain single. But if you can't, he said it's better if you go ahead and get married. So I don't think that's necessarily true in every situation, but certainly for the time being, when in the situation that was existing there, the present distress, it would have been good for that time. Go ahead, brother.
Well, it does kind of mirror what Jesus talked about. The disciples said, why should, and he said if you can't obtain, that we should. But it kind of appears that, to me anyway, that Jesus was teaching something very similar about, to serve God. I'm not saying that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a good discussion to be had in that, I think, and there's valid points in it. There's also valid points with the other, because if no one ever gets married, what's going to happen? In the beginning, God said it's not good for man to be alone, right? So, but think about Jesus. I mean, think about the mission that he had here on earth. What his life, how different would it have been if he had a family, if he got married? Can you imagine that? Been really hard, wouldn't it? Been really difficult to do what he did and to go the places he went and to do all those things. So, you think about Jesus, that's a valid point. You think about, even Paul says, at least at this time, he was unmarried, right? So, think about all the things that Paul did. And if he had a family to have to worry about and carry around, and how things might have been different for him. So,
You said, at least at this time, there's quite a little bit of discussion that maybe he was married.
yeah, if he was a member of the Sanhedrin, which we think he probably was, he would have been at some point in time. Which raises another question: what happened to his wife?
Well, I read one time that she had actually left him because he was a believer, and that's the reason he writes like he does here about, you're not
Maybe.
whatever chapter or
Maybe, I don't know. Go ahead, brother.
You know, I have heard a lot of people throughout my life before I became a child of God, even talk about the idea of, oh, well, they're just saying you have to get married to have sex, and that's not a good reason to get married. Do you think, at this time, arranged marriage was pretty common. Women were treated somewhat like property. Everybody here grew up in a world where we had the freedom, you can marry for love. You can marry because you genuinely like the person. Whereas, I wonder if when people read this and he's like, well, I mean, if you gotta go get married, it was because at that time in society, a guy could make connections with some girl's father and she's gonna be his wife, and that's just what's gonna happen. And I wonder if because we grew up with all that freedom to make our own choices in our society is why that's such a tough pill to swallow for some people. Because I know people that pill's got spikes all over it.
Yeah, well, Paul even talks about in chapter 7 there, a father giving his daughter in marriage,
Yeah.
and he talks about the idea, again, in part, if she wants to get married, don't keep her from getting married, If she doesn't get married, you're doing good, but if she does want to get married and she does, you're doing even better. Basically what he said, kind of paraphrasing it there, but yeah, so there's a number of ways to look at it. Certainly, the dating and marriage arrangements in that day and time were much, much different than they are in our society today. I always tell everybody there's not a scriptural way that the Bible says you have to do it. There are good ways, there are bad ways, and you read these stories in the Bible. Did it work? It worked. And you say it worked as good as ours works, didn't you? Some were successful, some were unsuccessful. But the heart of the individual had a lot to do with that. But yeah, parents had a tremendous say in that day and age of who you would marry. So, good point there. Anything else before we move to chapter 8 here? We just got a couple minutes left. That's kind of been our theme for these 2 chapter studies. But Paul talks about briefly here in chapter 8 food that has been sacrificed to idols. And he talks about having knowledge concerning this subject. And I do want to mention this because I think it's important. What is knowledge? If you have knowledge of something, what is that? What is the danger of having knowledge of something?
Held accountable.
Okay, yeah, that would be one. You'd be held accountable. But specifically, Paul's writing about here the knowledge of idols, right? And meat offered to idols. And things that we know. And sometimes, I think whenever you know something, there's kind of a danger of becoming arrogant. Or even proud. Kind of lack of better wording. Because you know. And it doesn't really matter what anybody else says, right? You ever been in that situation before? So you get a little, you get a little bit of pride built up, you get a little bit of arrogance, and when it comes to meat offered to idols, some of these people knew. They knew all about it. They knew that there was no such thing as other gods here upon this earth. There's only one true living God. They knew that meat offered to an idol was really just meat. And because of their knowledge, they kind of treated their brothers, or not kind of, I guess they did, their brothers and sisters who had yet to come to this grasp or understanding, treated them as they didn't know anything, as they were inferior to them. And so Paul talks about this idea here in chapter 8. We know verse 8 that food is nothing. Another thing about knowledge is, when we think about having knowledge, do we ever have complete knowledge? I mean, can you think of anything in your life where you have complete knowledge? We get a little bit of understanding or knowledge about something. We think we know everything about it, right? But it's always kind of lacking in those areas. There's some things that we don't know. There's some things probably that we've never considered before. Only God has that that benefit. And so our knowledge is always going to be partial. It's always going to be incomplete in some way. Did God attach any importance to idols? What did God say about idols in this chapter? Well, he said idols aren't gods no matter what the worshiper thinks about them, right? If you worship a piece of wood, does that make it a god? No. It doesn't matter what the worshiper thinks in their mind. There is no other God. And so while people might think that there are, in reality, there is only one. Not everybody, and especially these people who came from pagan backgrounds, not everybody had that knowledge. In other words, we might say some of these Christians were still immature in their knowledge. And they were still immature in their convictions. And so there was a danger of, if a person who had this knowledge, we know that an idol is nothing. We know that meat offered to an idol is just meat. It doesn't change it. It's not different in any way. If they kind of push that upon somebody who's immature, who hasn't grown in that knowledge yet, who hasn't come to that consciousness or state of acknowledgement yet, there was a danger of them slipping back, reverting back into idolatry, causing them to sin. And so Paul's writing about in this chapter, as Christians, we don't want to do anything to cause our brothers or sisters to sin. We don't want to do anything to cause them to stumble or go back into a life that God wouldn't approve of. And so knowledge, he says here in this chapter, knowledge is not the important thing. Love is. Because if you love your brother or sister, what are you always going to do?
Do what is best for them.
Yeah, you're always going to be looking to help and to benefit them, aren't you? And so it's not going to be about what do I know, what do I want. It's going to be about, is this going to cause, is this going to cause them to tail off into sin? Is it going to push them down a road you don't want to push them down? And Paul basically says within this chapter, he said, I limit my freedom, my Christian freedoms, because if I do anything that would cause my brother or my sister to sin, and that's the word stumble there. Sometimes people use that to interpret it. I don't like that. That's what it means. No, that's not what Paul was talking about. He's talking about sinning. That's what stumbling is, falling, tripping, falling short of God's glory. If I'm going to do something that would cause my brother or my sister to sin with my Christian liberties, Paul said, I'm not going to use those liberties. And so if it's going to be meat, he said, I'm not going to eat that meat. I'm not going to do anything that would cause them to sin.
Why were they eating this meat that was offered to idols anyhow? Was it cheaper?
Well, honestly, in the marketplace, it probably would have been hard to not find meat offered to idols. Because almost every family, they had all their gods, they had all their idols, and almost every family would offer, their meat to some type of idol. Then sometimes they would take it and sell it in the marketplace under the specific name of that god and make a profit off of it. But, it would have been a very common practice. And so it would have been everywhere in the city of Corinth. And it's not like there was, just an isolated case here and there, but it affected their everyday life. I think we get that from reading these verses. But a lot of these people, again, they didn't grow up, they weren't Jews. They didn't grow up knowing the law of Moses and observing it. They came from these idolatrous backgrounds. And so for them, it was really hard to see that meat as not being something special or different from other meat. And Paul's talking about, they're weak. They'll grow. They'll come to that realization. They'll come to that knowledge and understanding. But hold off. Don't do anything that's going to push them away or cause them to go back that direction or, violate their conscience in any way. So it's a good principle, but a lot of different ways you can apply it in the church today. All right, we're past time. Anybody have any thoughts, comments, questions, or anything before we end?